Welcome to episode 60 of the MMA Rundown podcast. We're going to start off talking about Gilbert Burns pulling off a bit of an upset in the main event against Tyron Woodley at the UFC Apex show. Then I'll recap the entire card of the UFC Apex, preview UFC 250, which is going to be coming up this coming weekend, talk about some fights that were just announced over the course of the week. From there, I'll talk about a story with Colby Covington where he announced he announced that he was leaving American Top Team. So I'll talk about that whole situation and what I've gathered from his interviews. Preview an event that's coming up this weekend for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on Flow Grappling called Who's Number One. They're going to have a lot of really good matches there. I don't know if their card's fully complete yet, but at the top of the card they have Gordon Ryan going against Kyle Boehm. They also have Nicky Ryan, who's going to be competing as well, so I'll talk about that card as well. And the final thing I'm going to talk about, and usually when I do these shows, the order I go in is usually things that I think are most interesting and most important first, and then just kind of go down the line from there. Or at least most interesting and most important to most people. That's usually why wrestling and jiu-jitsu tends to go towards the back. In this case, the topic that I'm going to talk about at the end, I'm not talking about it at the end because I think it's least important. I'm talking about it at the end because this is effectively a sports show. It's mostly about martial arts. It's not about political opinions, and political opinions are definitely going to get involved in that topic. So I want to leave it in a spot where if you don't want to hear politics from me, which is perfectly understandable, you're tuning in because you're trying to listen about sports. Then once I get to that topic, you can cut it off. If you are interested, then obviously you can keep listening from there. But I'll talk about the situation with George Floyd, talk about just a jiu-jitsu person's take on the actual video of his death, and then also talk about what has happened ever since then. So first topic, again, is Gilbert Burns getting the win over Tyron Woodley. In the last podcast, I said that I thought that the odds on this were absurd, that Tyron Woodley should be a much bigger favorite than he was, and that I had bet all of my promotional account on Tyron Woodley. Obviously not looking too good right now. So I guess first off, I'll talk about why I thought that Tyron Woodley should be a major favorite and what didn't happen that I thought would happen. So my take on the fight is that Gilbert Burns obviously is a very good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu player. Most of his game is top. I figured it's going to be difficult for him to get on top of Tyron Woodley. He'd either have to drop him or have to perfectly time and execute a takedown, which I didn't really figure he could do. Now, granted, in the second round, he hit a beautiful double leg, which proved me wrong there. And in the first round was able to drop him and get on top that way. But even when he does get on top, it's not as though he's a guy who, once he gets on top of you, he's going to finish you immediately. Like, he'll continue to hold a strong position and continue to advance, but it's not like he's one of those guys where the second he gets on top, like, you got to be worried that he's going to get a finish and get one really quickly, whereas a guy like Damian Maia is very good about quickly advancing towards the back and then finishing you off the back. Gilbert Burns, though dangerous, obviously, it's not as though he's one of those guys in the past who immediately gets the finish. So the thought was, even if he does get Tyron Woodley down, it's not as though he's going to be likely to finish him very quickly. And even in the first round, when he was able to drop him and get to mount really early in the round, you figured with all that amount of time that if ever there was a good opportunity for Gilbert Burns, it'd be a rock Tyron Woodley underneath him early on in a fight. And even still in that position, he wasn't able to get the finish. So at least that thought was correct. Where it went wrong is that I figured that over the course of 5 rounds, Gilbert Burns is a guy who throws a lot of wide punches, a lot of winging punches, and he also tends to keep his hands down. And I figured that with Woodley, he's a guy who's very good about timing people as they come in. Even in fights where there's not a lot going on, it's not uncommon for him to get pushed up against the fence and sort of wait to pick his spots. Oftentimes he'll find it, and I figure with a guy like Burns who throws wide punches, who keeps his hands down, that Woodley was going to catch him a few times, and with Woodley, it only takes one good shot for him to change the course of the fight and at the very least win the round, if not get the finish after landing that big shot. And he never really was able to do that. Burns did a really good job of not getting too wild with his punches. For the most part, he was reacting really quickly whenever Woodley would come in. He was doing a good job of keeping his hands up when Woodley was punching. So Burns was still punching or still striking with his hands down for much of the fight, but anytime that Woodley would come in, Burns did a great job of getting his hands up reflexively. Now, again, it's good to have your hands up just as a general rule, because sometimes you're not going to be able to respond quick enough to a counter, and that's when you can get hurt the most. And that still, I guess, is a risk for Burns. But in this fight, he was able to time Woodley every time that Woodley was able to come in and try to counter him, and did a good job of keeping his hands up, was able to block most of the punches. A couple of them landed, but for the most part, Burns was able to take him as he was moving backwards, so he didn't really take the full power on him. So the threats that Woodley was able to pose to Burns did a good enough job of making adjustments to them, being ready anytime Woodley was coming in and blitzing him, and doing a good job of covering up at the head. And I guess that was one of the things that Woodley could have done a little bit better, is that there were some times where he was blitzing Burns and every shot was to the head, and Burns did a really good job of just covering up the head entirely. You would have liked to have seen Woodley mix it up to the body a little bit too when he was throwing some of those combinations, but for Woodley, the combinations didn't come very often, and when they did, it was all to the head. For the most part, it was blocked, and so Burns was able to survive Woodley's offense, but then while Woodley was trying to be patient and pick his spots, Burns was doing a good job of landing nice leg kicks, landing some decent shots, and then also dropping him a couple times. Or it dropped him once, I think he stumbled him another time, but didn't completely drop him. So overall, over the course of 25 minutes, first time we'd seen Gilbert Burns in a 25-minute fight in the UFC. Did a really good job, was very patient, explosive when he needed to be, showed some great takedown offense. Again, this is something I've talked about in the past, where people tend to look at fights on paper and they'll say, well, this guy's an All-American wrestler and this guy didn't wrestle in college, therefore the guy who didn't wrestle in college is never going to be able to take the All-American down. Wrestling, jiu-jitsu, striking, they're all techniques. If you have a high pedigree in them, if you're an All-American wrestler, if you're like a black belt world champion, that tends to mean that you're very good about implementing them, but that doesn't mean that they can't be implemented on you. And when we saw the really good timing on that takedown in the second round, we saw a setup that wasn't a wrestling setup. It was a MMA setup where he was timing a punch, and Gilbert Burns was able to shoot underneath, just a very good execution of technique on the double leg, and was able to get Woodley down. So that's one of the things that makes Gilbert Burns stand out compared to other jiu-jitsu guys who get into MMA, is that Gilbert Burns has very good wrestling compared to most other jiu-jitsu guys who get into MMA, and Gilbert Burns also really has put in the time to improve his striking. Now, again, there's obviously still technical improvements that can be made, but the guy hits really hard, comes at some weird angles, and it's one of those things where if you're fighting him, it's going to be difficult because you know if he takes you down, you're in big trouble because he's an incredibly high-level jiu-jitsu guy and he can wrestle pretty well. And that's it's also worth mentioning his defensive wrestling was fantastic in this fight too. There were some times where Woodley was clinching up with Burns and trying to take him down and wasn't able to. And it's not that Woodley didn't want to get on top. I think Woodley would have been fine on top, especially with Burns. Woodley, I'm sure in an MMA context, could do enough to stall there, and maybe he's not going to get a ton of offense off on Burns from top, but he can at least do enough to kill some time and get his breath back. And it looked as though that was something he was trying to do, but Burns did a good job of defending those takedowns. So, again, if you're fighting Burns, the wrestling is something you have to be worried about. The jiu-jitsu is something you have to be worried about. But then if you give his grappling too much attention, then you're leaving openings for him to throw some winging punches that can obviously do a lot of damage as well. So for Gilbert Burns, as far as what's next for him, he called out his teammate in a fairly respectful manner, and the teammate being Kamaru Usman, the champion, because obviously Burns wants a title shot. From the interviews I heard from Burns, and I could be missing some, I didn't hear anyone ask him specifically, hey, Kamaru is your teammate. I'm sure you've trained with him a bunch. I'm sure you've sparred with him a bunch. Tell us about those rounds. That, to me, is a very interesting question. It's one that I don't know that I've heard an answer to yet. For Burns, him and Woodley know, or not Woodley, him and Usman at this point kind of know where they stack up against each other, at least in the training room. There are definitely some differences in the actual fight, but at least in the training room, they know where they stack up with each other. So what's interesting about that call out is he's calling out a guy where he knows where he stands with him. Is it one of those things where the title fight's going to make him the most money, so he just wants to guarantee the most money, whether or not he thinks he's going to win the fight? Does he know something based off of their training where he's like, you know what, I actually, based off of training with this guy, I'm pretty sure I can beat him, and I want my chance to do so right now? Like, there's a much bigger aspect to the story that hasn't really gotten touched on yet, and part of that is because I don't think a lot of people expected Burns to get the win, let alone a dominant win. And so the thought of him being in the title picture wasn't something that people really put too much thought into. But now that it is something that people are thinking about, it's going to be interesting to see the follow-up on that. Do I think he's going to get the title fight, though? That's kind of going to be a timing thing. Right now, the Masvidal versus Usman fight probably makes the most sense for the title. Masvidal, though he's being linked to Nate Diaz, has not signed to fight Nate Diaz, so he's technically still available. If they're trying to get Usman to fight in July, and Gilbert Burns is going to be ready in July, I guess Gilbert Burns becomes an option now. But I don't know that he's going to jump ahead of Masvidal, and I don't know that he should jump ahead of Masvidal. Covington probably isn't in the picture right now. I think he still needs to get his training situation figured out. Woodley obviously is not in the picture anymore. Edwards could be in the picture now that he can travel from the UK. That would be a rematch, though. Does the UFC want to make that? So it's nice that the welterweight division has a lot of options right now, but it's not exactly clear who's going to get the next shot. But it definitely is possible that Burns could be the guy to get it, especially since his manager, Ali Abdelaziz, is also the manager of Kamaru Usman, so you would figure that, at least from Kamaru's side, especially if Kamaru thinks that this is going to be an easy win for him, that could be a fight that they push for. So the stories from the training room, I think, are they're probably never really going to come out, nor should they. But any move that Kamaru Usman makes going forward is going to be with the thought of what happens in those training sessions in mind. Any move that Gilbert Burns makes moving forward is going to have that thought in mind as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how things play out. As for Woodley, man, I mean, it's tough with him because even in the fights that he does well in, it's not as though like what we saw last night is something that we haven't seen before, like whether it was in the loss to McDonald, the loss to Shields, or even some of his wins like the fights against Stephen Thompson, where he tends to be a little bit tentative up against the fence, wait to pick his shots, and then try to explode forward. It's just that in the fights that he'd won in the past, he was successful in dropping his opponents and doing a lot of damage. He was successful in dropping Daren and then finishing him on the ground. He was successful in dropping Stephen Thompson, and then having some dominant rounds against him as well. Whereas in this fight with Burns, when he would explode forward, Burns was able to react quickly enough and block it and not take any of the damage. And so the bad side of Woodley that we'd seen in the past was there in this fight as well, but the good side was snuffed out by Burns, by him being able to block the punches and get out of the way. So is it safe to say that Woodley's washed up? I don't know about that. I think Woodley's still a dangerous fighter. He's still a powerful fighter. He can still hit hard, still very quick, still has very good wrestling. So though Burns got the win here, it's not as though Woodley isn't still a danger to a lot of the top guys in the division, but where he goes from here, I think at this point, Woodley's going to need to take some time to heal his leg. He said that he had some issues with his leg going into the fight, and that the leg kicks definitely made things a lot worse for him. So give him some time to heal up his leg and come back. I'm sure he wants to eventually get another shot at a win. For him, the biggest fight's going to be that Colby Covington fight. That was a fight that we were hoping to see probably instead of the Gilbert Burns fight right now, but it seems like Colby's side didn't agree to it. After watching that fight, I think a lot of people think, hey, if this is what Gilbert Burns did to Tyron Woodley, imagine what Colby could do to him. That's definitely a thought to consider. For Colby, if you're ever going to want to try to get a win over Woodley, now seems like the time to go for it. So maybe that might get him into it. Both of them are coming off of losses. Granted, Woodley's not coming off of 2 losses. But if you give Colby the time to set up his training camp, you give Woodley the time to heal up, I think that Colby versus Woodley fight's going to make a lot of sense. Granted, it'd be interesting to see Colby versus Usman again, but he's coming off of a loss. There are other interesting matchups for Usman. I think if you do Woodley versus Covington and then give Usman someone like Jorge Masvidal, then I think the division's going to move forward pretty well. And then at that point, maybe you do Gilbert Burns versus Leon Edwards and just try to figure out who gets the title shot after that. I guess if Woodley gets the win over Covington, then he's probably not going to get the next title fight. If Covington gets the win, at least from an entertainment standpoint, you're probably going to want to put Covington in there. Although the winner of the Edwards versus Burns fight probably should be the one put in there next, assuming that all 3 of those matchups are made. But it remains to be seen what comes next. Obviously, matches aren't made the day after a fight, so come Tuesday, we'll see if the UFC starts making any moves and see if any news leaks in terms of who they're planning on moving forward with at the welterweight or at the top of the welterweight division in terms of matchups, in terms of who's getting a shot at Usman and who's getting put in other number 1 contender type fights. On to the rest of the card. In the co-main event, we had a heavyweight fight between Augusto Sakai and Blagoy Ivanov. Wasn't watching this one super closely, but it did seem like Sakai was landing the harder, more powerful shots throughout each of the 3 rounds, so I thought that he was going to win all 3 rounds. He did have that tough spot there in the 3rd round where he was about to get thrown with a headlock throw by Ivanov, and then he grabbed the fence and was able to maintain his balance and stop the throw there. Whether it should be a warning or a point, I mean, it's definitely illegal what he did. I have no issue if they take a point away right there, because it definitely affected the round. If he gets put on his back, you don't know how the rest of the round's going to go. It's definitely possible with a guy like Ivanov that Ivanov holds him down and is able to win that round. So it's probably fair to take a point away. Now, oftentimes with fouls, points aren't taken away immediately on the first foul, whether it's a shot to the nuts, a poke to the eye. Honestly, a poke to the eye is probably a lot more damaging over the course of a fight than grabbing the fence in a single round is, but oftentimes those pokes to the eye don't get penalized with a point immediately, whereas the fence grab, the hope would be that it is. You could say, well, the poke to the eye is unintentional and the fence grab is intentional. I mean, that's a fair argument. I think sometimes with the fence grabs, just generally as a person, if you're falling down, you try to grab something or you try to do whatever you can not to lose balance. And depending on where Sakai trains, I don't know if he has a fence in his gym or not, if that's something where he's had to like work that habit out. But if you aren't normally near a fence, and all of a sudden you're in a fight and you're losing balance and the fence is right there, maybe just reflexively you're going to grab it. Doesn't make it any less illegal, but does that mean it should always be a point docked, or that he should always have a point docked when it happens? Tough to say. If it was docked, then given the way that the scores worked out, this would have been a draw. From what I saw, I thought it should have been, even if you take the point away, it's still 2 rounds to 0 rather than 2 rounds to 1, or rather than 2 rounds to 1 and then the -1 point making it a draw. So I still felt as though Sakai should have gotten the win here. He did get the win here, so I'm not terribly upset about how that all worked out. Fight before that, we had Billy Quarantillo versus Spike Carlisle. This was a really fun fight. Carlisle just really strong and aggressive, came forward, throwing like a running push kick to start off the fight. Most of the fight happened on the ground. Quarantillo got into a few pretty good positions where he's getting close to finishing Carlisle, but Carlisle did a pretty good job defensively to get out of there. Not only was he really strong, but he was also pretty solid defensively. Anytime his back would be taken, he'd sort of get like that baseball back grip, pull Quarantillo's arm over to the wrong side, and then turn into him. So he was able to escape the back control that way. Also was in a couple triangles where he was able to sort of like shrug his way out of them, which I guess between him being sweaty and then him also being really strong, that was a pretty good defense. But typically when you're caught in a triangle like that, it's pretty tough to get out, especially as easy as he made it look. So again, got to give Carlisle credit for his defensive grappling there. Had that weird moment at the end of the first round where he was just walking away before the round ended and ended up getting dropped as he was looking away. So that was pretty weird, but overall really fun fight. Probably should have been fight of the night. But I feel like there was a lot of push online for another fight to get it, which was a fun fight too, just because of what one of the fighters was saying. So I'll talk about that when we get there, but hopefully both of these guys get a little bit of extra money, even if they don't get the full 50,000. Fight before that, we had Brock Weaver versus Roosevelt Roberts. Roberts was looking really sharp in this fight. His right hand especially. Didn't have much of a windup on, was just really quick, just going right down the pipe with his right cross. It was giving Weaver a lot of problems. Whenever Weaver would try to grapple with him, was really effective in taking Roberts down. But in the second round, Roberts was able to get the fight to the ground, was able to get on Brock Weaver's back, and after a couple unsuccessful rear naked choke attempts, was finally able to finish with one and got the win there. Had some words for Weaver afterwards. It's not exactly clear what their beef is, if it was just the two of them were just kind of mugging each other before the fight and then they were just taking it personal, or if there was something more than that. There was apparently a fake Twitter account for Roosevelt Roberts that was saying that he wanted to beat up Brock Weaver because there was some footage of Weaver beating up a dog. I haven't seen the footage of Brock Weaver abusing dogs. That's something I've heard a couple times on Twitter, but I've never actually seen it. So I don't know the truth of it. I don't know. So I guess first off, I don't know if Brock Weaver actually like beats dogs. Hopefully he doesn't. That'd be a really bad thing if he did. But then I don't know if that's something that Roosevelt Roberts himself was aware of, and if it was something that like motivated him to be more aggressive towards Weaver. But regardless, this was a pretty good fight. Really good showing for Roosevelt Roberts, and it'll definitely be interesting to see what he does next for Weaver. Technically, this makes him 1-1 in the UFC. His first fight, he got knocked out, but it was by an illegal knee, so he ended up winning by DQ. So he's 1-1, but after coming off the Contender Series and being hyped up quite a bit, really hasn't looked all that great in his first couple fights in the UFC. First fight on the main card is one that I did a separate video on, just recapping the technique that Mackenzie Dern used to get the finish here, but Mackenzie Dern, in her return after losing to Amanda Ribas, gets the submission win by knee bar over Hannah Cyphers. Sort of weird how it all worked out in terms of once the fight got to the ground. On the feet, it was just your typical Mackenzie Dern fight where she just kind of throwing wide winging punches, keeping her chin up. And I mean, I guess when you're throwing really hard, even if the technique isn't all there, if it lands, it can definitely sting Hannah Cyphers. It looked like Cyphers might have been stung a little bit before they ended up clinching up. But either way, once they clinched up, Mackenzie Dern went for basically a no-gi variant of a judo throw called an uchimata, where you take, I'm trying to think of, for Dern it was her right leg, and she put it in between Cyphers' legs and then just kind of like kicked up and backwards to get underneath her hips and lift her up and then pull her over with her upper body. So initially she got on top. In judo rules, Mackenzie Dern would have scored a takedown there, but obviously this isn't judo, and Cyphers was able to roll through and ended up on top herself. From there, it was kind of interesting because for Cyphers, if you're fighting Mackenzie Dern, you're fighting a jiu-jitsu world champion, you have to have some kind of plan in terms of how you want to approach it if you do get on top. Like, is it going to be one of those situations where it's like, hey, this is MMA, I'm just going to play tight and throw some punches, stay active, and try to win from top? Am I going to just try to get the hell out of there the first second I can? And for Cypher's, it seemed as though she was kind of like stuck in between them, where she didn't know exactly what she wanted to do. Like, it was just kind of like this tentative position, but she would like throw strikes here and there. But in the meantime, Mackenzie Daren was pretty focused on what she wanted to do in terms of attacking. Was immediately looking for the knee bar. Cypher's didn't really seem to know how she wanted to defend that either. For a knee bar, you can either just try to drive right in and sort of stack them, especially when they're rolling underneath the way that Mackenzie Daren was. Daren effectively was in a position where she kind of had to stack herself. So from there, you can just kind of stay heavy and keep her stuck in that position and just throw a bunch of punches, especially in an MMA context where you can do that. Your other option would be just to try to bail out, but that's something you gotta do quickly. You can't wait until the last second to try to bail out, otherwise you're probably gonna be too late. And so initially she was stacking into Daren, then decided to try to bail out. That didn't work out for her. She ended up getting sat down after Daren was able to extend the leg, and then from there Daren went from going with the traditional knee bar that you see, where you have both hands holding around the back of the heel on your chest, to then switching it underneath your armpit, which is a much tighter position. And then Daren ended up bellying down and hipping into the knee bar, which made it even tighter, and was able to get the finish from there. So really good showing from Mackenzie Daren there, at least on the ground. On the feet, it was just kind of same old. As far as where she goes from here, I mean, I'm sure they'll still try to give her similar fights to Cypher's, where she's not necessarily fighting the top-ranked girls, fighting girls who she should be able to get the fight to the ground with eventually. And I mean, for the UFC, Daren's someone who has some star qualities. Now, granted, her fighting skills aren't quite there, but at least from the personality standpoint, I guess people are willing to put up with it, and from the looks, people definitely like that. So I'm sure the UFC is still going to try to keep giving Daren winnable matchups, but in terms of her being a future contender at the division, I'm not quite sure that I've seen the improvements that I need to see in her, especially in the striking or the wrestling, yet to believe that she's ever going to be a top contender at 115. But with that being said, still a good win for her, and she definitely deserves credit for it. On the prelims, in the prelim main event, we had Kalin versus Antonia Shevchenko. So Chukagian's last fight had been against Valentina, and that fight did not go particularly well for her. So in this next fight, she draws her sister. Antonina, here's the thing, and I put up a tweet about this, and this is sort of a tough thing to get a read on with her. So looking at Antonina's record, she had fought in MMA in 2003 and then took a giant amount of time off, and then returned in 2017 to continue fighting MMA. And that's something I've mentioned before, and I feel like I've mentioned every other week, is this annoying thing to me when you have professional MMA fighters who will decide they want to go pro in MMA, but then like a skill set, whether it's wrestling, whether it's jiu-jitsu, whether it's striking, just doesn't even grow at the same level as a hobbyist who trains like 3 times a week would have theirs grow. So the idea being, like, if you've been training MMA for 10 years, then you would assume that a hobbyist, if they had also just picked up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu 10 years ago and was training just 3 times a week, where would their game be? And then you would hope that the 10-year MMA pro would at least have that level of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like, that was the idea that I was saying. And watching this fight, Antonia's Jiu-Jitsu was just awful. Like, it was really bad. It wasn't just the technique, it was just the lack of confidence in her ability to do anything on the ground. It seemed like there were some times where she kind of knew what she had to do, but she just never pulled the trigger. Sometimes that can be where you're just physically not feeling well, and maybe mentally you know what to do, and maybe physically you've done it before in the training room, but for whatever reason it is, just on that day you can't do it. If I was giving her like the best possible excuse, that would be what I'd say, but we've seen bad jiu-jitsu from her in the past as well, especially in that loss to Roxanne Modafferi. So for Antonia Shevchenko, even if she fully committed to professional MMA back in 2017, and it's been like 2.5, 3 years, like 2.5, 3 years for a hobbyist means they're probably an okay blue belt at this point. And even then, if you're an okay blue belt, especially if you're competitive, you've probably at least trained with some higher belts, and you don't just get frozen over. It's like, oh, this higher belt has a good position on me, I can't move, or else something bad's going to happen. And that's sort of what it looked like for Antonia Shevchenko, where it was like, anytime she get in any sort of bad position on the ground, she'd be afraid to make a movement, because it's almost like, well, if I do this, what are they going to do to me in response? And so she pretty much just did nothing, and it was just a really bad showing when the fight hit the mat. On the feet, there was sort of this concern that the fight would go back to the mat after the first round, so there wasn't great striking either. So we really didn't get to see a whole lot of positive out of Antonia Shevchenko. Kalin Chukagian was dominant on the ground. With that being said, It's pretty surprising that she couldn't get a finish on the ground, especially not in the first round. So one of the surprising things to me is that when Shevchenko's or when Chookagian got Shevchenko's back in the first round, there were multiple rear naked choke attempts and multiple rear naked choke attempts where the choking arm was underneath the chin. Now with rear naked chokes, there are a couple common finishes that you can use in terms of your grips. There's the one that pretty much everyone has seen or knows of, which is the one where the choking arm grabs the bicep of the non-choking arm, then the non-choking arm wraps around, goes behind the head, and then sort of like goes like sort of like into the back of the neck and pushes the head forward into the choking arm. So that's your typical rear naked choke finish. There's also the Don Fry finish, where the choking arm grabs the palm, so you get a palm-to-palm grip of the non-choking arm. That non-choking arm, then you kind of like wrap it around where your elbow is in their back, and you're just kind of like driving that inwards as you just really squeeze tight. That's not as tight of a choke as the traditional rear naked choke, but it's still incredibly tight, and it's still more than tight enough to get the finish and to put someone out if they don't tap. And so for Chookagian, and it just seemed like every time she went for the rear naked choke, she was adamant on getting the traditional grip, or she brought the other arm around, and she wasn't terribly quick about doing that. So it seemed like every time she did it, she at least give Shevchenko enough time where she could grab the non-choking arm, peel it off, and be able to escape. But a lot of times where once Chookagian had put that right arm through, or put her choking arm through, and had the hand behind the shoulder, it looked as though had she just gone for the Don Fry grip there, like she had Shevchenko dead to rights, and she never really went for that grip, and it was pretty surprising that she never made that adjustment, especially after having a couple different attempts at it where it didn't work with the traditional grip. So for that reason, she wasn't able to get the finish in the first round, and then in the later rounds, it seemed like there were some more opportunities for her, and she just kind of opted to stay in mount and maintain top position rather than taking some risks to go for some submissions. There were definitely some moments where it looked like arm bars were becoming available from mount, and Shevchenko never, or not Shevchenko, Chookagian never really wanted to go for him. So in a way, very good win for her in that it was a dominant three-round win, 30-25 on all three scorecards. But it seemed like this was a fight that she should have been able to get a finish on the ground, and she didn't. Fight before that, we had Gabe Green versus Daniel Rodriguez. Rodriguez was the longer, more technical boxer there. Was just kind of keeping Green at a distance. Later on in the fight, Green was getting a lot more aggressive and just coming in a little bit wildly and coming hard at Rodriguez. It was a pretty fun fight to watch, but it was pretty clear that Rodriguez had the edge there, and he got the win. Fight before that, we had Jamal Hill versus Klidson Abreu. Hill, much longer striker than Abreu. It was pretty clear that Abreu wanted to get this fight to the mat, but wasn't really all that effective in closing the distance. Took some hard punches on the outside as he was trying to get in. Took some hard knees, got dropped, and was finished on the ground soon after. Fight before that is the one that I was mentioning before in terms of fight of the night. This one did win fight of the night. It was Brandon Royval versus Tim Elliott. A story heading into this fight was that Royval still has another job outside of being a professional MMA fighter, and didn't want to have to return to that job, and was really hoping for a $50,000 bonus so he can quit his job. And even in the post-fight interview, kind of had like nearly was brought to tears about it, and there were some people online where it's like, oh my god, look how bad this is. A professional UFC fighter is crying because they don't make enough money. Like, what a shitty sport. And I feel like some of that pressure might have pushed the UFC into choosing this fight over the Quarantillo Carlisle fight for fight of the night. As I mentioned before, though, this was still a very good fight. It's not as though like it's a travesty that this one fight of the night. On many other nights, it would definitely be the best fight of the night. But I definitely think the Quarantillo Carlisle probably deserved it. But that being said, still a very fun fight. Tim Elliott was very aggressive in his grappling. Was very effective in taking Royval down early on in the first round. It seemed like a lot of times he was like trying to jump for this inverted triangle, which was kind of odd from top position. In some positions where it looked like he could have just gone to a regular crucifix, he was like trying to jump over and get a triangle position. It seems like that's probably something he's worked on in training that he wanted to do in a fight, but was losing position doing it. So at times, Elliott would get some dominant positions and then sort of take some unnecessary risks that would end up giving up those positions. But with that being said, definitely won the first round. Second round, again, it's going fairly similar to the first round, but gets in a position where he's going for a guillotine choke, and is sort of caught in this. I think knee smash is the term that's used for it. I don't think this is exactly the folding pass position. You could also call it like the BJ Penn pass position, where the two legs are across on the same side and the guy on top's knee is in between. But Elliott was going for a guillotine from there. Now, technically, you can still finish because the head is on the same side as the choking side, but the choke wasn't quite tight enough, and then once Royval was able to pop out, he then just did a BJ Penn pass right into mount. From there, Elliott was trying to turn out, and then in the process, when his back was briefly given up, Royval had set up an arm triangle choke, and then as Elliott then turned back onto his back, the arm triangle choke was pretty much just there set up, and then Royval went for the finish from there. It didn't seem like it was 100% in. It was somewhat tight, but it didn't seem like it was completely in. But it also seemed like Tim Elliott was exhausted at that point in the fight, given the output that he had in the first round, and so Royval had enough of a squeeze there between the squeeze and between Elliott being exhausted to get the tap. So for Royval, it's his first fight in the UFC. He was a former LFA champion, so it's big for him to get a win here. In terms of how he looked, I mean, the striking, it just kind of seemed like he was a little wild, like he threw some wild techniques, which again is fun to watch, but it's not like I was watching the most technical striker I've ever seen out there. Like, it definitely seems like there's a lot of openings there on the feet where he can get in trouble. On the ground, he was definitely caught in a lot of bad positions by Elliott. Did a decent job to get out. Sometimes Elliott was kind of helping him out by jumping for some crazy techniques like those inverted triangles. But still, defensively, was sound enough to get out of some bad positions with Tim Elliott. And his guard wasn't offering too much of a threat to Tim Elliott. Now, they showed a highlight before the fight of him getting a nice omoplata into trying to switch back to a triangle. The triangle wasn't there, and then hitting an armbar to win the LFA title. So it's not like he can't fight off his back. He's got some submissions, but it's not like he was necessarily looking like a killer off his back against Tim Elliott. Decent awareness on that guillotine attempt to be able to get out and then find himself in a position where he could pass him out immediately. Did the right thing to pass him out there. Did the right thing to set up the arm triangle in the middle of a different transition. So while Elliott's worried about position, Royval is setting up a submission. So with that being said, the submission was set up pretty well prior to Elliott's back ever hitting the mat, and then once his back was on the mat, arm triangle was already set up. Royval was able to get the finish from there. So got to give him some credit there. But in terms of him being like this can't-miss prospect who's going to be a big problem at featherweight, I don't know that I see him as like a future title challenger. I guess obviously he's still young in his career, he has a lot of time to improve, but as of right now, it's not as though he's a guy where, given the right matchups, he could prove to be like a top 5 guy anytime soon. Like I think he's definitely got a lot more work to do, but it was good to see him put on an exciting fight. It's good to see him be able to get that $50,000 bonus and officially now be able to quit his job and focus strictly on MMA. Fight before that, we had Louis Smolka versus Casey Kenny. Smolka was having some trouble on the feet with Kenny. Kenny was doing a really good job, both with his kicks and then also landing some good punches to the head. Smolka sometimes would just try to like cover up and then just like rush it and throw some shots to the body, hoping that would do him some favors over time, but didn't really work out that way. And then in the first round, because this was just a one-round fight, they get into a bit of a weird position where Casey Kenny's going for a high elbow guillotine. Had just one arm in at the time, eventually puts Smolka on his butt and is on top of half guard and still has that one arm grip, and then starts moving to where he's switching it to just like a high elbow grip. So his right arm was underneath the chin. He was then trying to bring his left arm in to get the high elbow grip. From what he said in the interview, it sounds as though he did connect that grip. It looked like he was trying to do that. You could tell he was definitely looking to get that left hand involved when you watch the replay of the finish. Some people were saying that it was a one-arm guillotine. It doesn't look like it was a one-arm guillotine. It looks like it was just a high elbow guillotine from top of half guard. It was kind of weird how the finish came about in that he technically did finish in Smolka's half guard. He had, Kenny's left leg was in between Smolka's two legs, but Smolka's legs weren't doing anything to try to control Kenny's legs. Typically, it's tough to choke a guy out in their own guard because if you are in your own guard, it's not usually too hard to push away on your opponent's hips. So the idea being, the reason why getting choked in your own closed guard is very uncommon, especially, even in a gi where gi chokes are available, is because if someone is choking you in your guard, what you have to do to defend that is just push off on their hips or offset their balance. Oftentimes with the choke, you're committing both arms to it, so you don't really have those arms available as a base. So if someone's choking you in your guard, for example, if you can go from having your legs wrapped around them to then going foot on hip and then kicking away, you can take a lot of pressure off, and then you can also start threatening sweeps with both arms being committed to the choke. So that you can end up getting on top. And then from half guard, though you don't have both feet involved usually, the leg that is wrapped around their leg that's inside, you can still control that leg. You can try to scoot underneath and try to get underneath their base and rock them off their base. Again, if you can do enough to threaten a sweep, then they might have to take an arm off and defend the sweep. But even if not, you can usually do enough to where you can set up a half butterfly guard where you can get that other leg in as a butterfly hook and then extend away with that. And so for Louis Smolka, it didn't seem like he was trying to do either of it. It also didn't seem like the choke was fully locked in immediately when he got to that half guard position. It looked like Kenny had to like readjust at that point and get that high elbow guillotine. So it seemed like Smolka stopped fighting a little bit sooner than he had to, which was a little bit odd. But either way, a high elbow guillotine from top of half guard is definitely an effective finish if you can get it. I really enjoy using the high elbow guillotine. I've gotten high elbow guillotines from top of half guard. Usually it takes a little bit more work than what Kenny had to do there. I think Smolka may have given up the fight a little bit earlier than he had to, but again, if Kenny did eventually connect the hands there and get that high elbow grip, it's not as though Smolka was tapping to a choke that wouldn't have put him out. It's definitely a choke that can put you out, but it seemed like there could have been a little bit more fight from him. First fight on the card is Vince Morales versus Chris Gutierrez. Morales was just having a really hard time with Gutierrez. Gutierrez was just throwing leg kick after leg kick after leg kick. Anytime Morales would switch stances, Gutierrez would then attack the other leg, and Morales was having some real difficulty throughout the first round. But in the second round, it was just more of the same, and eventually Morales went down from the leg kicks, and the ref had to step in and call a stop to the fight. So that covers it for the UFC Vegas / UFC Apex event. For UFC 250, I'll go through the card that is now listed on the ESPN website, so hopefully this has the full card. Main event is going to be Amanda Nunes versus Felicia Spencer, which is, again, not a great main event. Felicia Spencer, not very good striking, decent jiu-jitsu. I guess if you're going to say one interesting thing about this fight, the fights that are the most interesting to watch, the ones that get hardcore fans the most intrigued, are ones where you know that if a fight goes to a certain area, one fighter has a distinct advantage. If the fight goes to another area, the other fighter has a distinct advantage. If you think about that Conor versus Khabib fight, granted there was a lot of personality stuff involved there. There was a lot of bad blood as well. But one of the reasons why that fight was so big and so interesting to the hardcore fans was that there was this idea where if the fight is on the feet, Conor McGregor has a big advantage. If the fight is on the ground, then Khabib has the big advantage. So the question becomes, where does the fight take place, and who's able to make sure that the fight stays in the area that they want it to be. To an extent with this fight, if Felicia Spencer does get on top and is able to control on the ground, Felicia Spencer should have the advantage on the ground over Amanda Nunes, and Amanda Nunes definitely should have the advantage over Felicia Spencer on the feet. So there is some of that. It's just that Felicia Spencer's wrestling just isn't very good. So her ability to get the fight to the mat isn't something that I would really bank on here. Her striking in terms of even closing the distance to set that up isn't all that good, so I don't see her being able to do that. And even if she does get the fight to the mat, Amanda Nunes is a black belt in jiu-jitsu. Now, granted, she looked really bad in her last fight on the ground against Jermaine Duranamy. But with that being said, it just seems unlikely to me that Felicia Spencer is going to get this fight to the ground, is going to get on top, and is going to be able to pass guard, get to a finishing position, and actually be able to get the finish. But at least there is a path to victory for her. So I guess in that way, at least there's something where it's like, hey, maybe Spencer does get the fight to the ground. What if she does? Like, what's she going to be able to do? So there is some of that intrigue if you're going to try to say something nice about this fight. But with that being said, I just don't think that Spencer has the tools to get the fight where she needs to get it. And for that reason, I just see Nunes getting a pretty dominant win here. Co-main event is going to be a really good, and it's interesting that this is the co-main event, by the way, especially given the fight that's going to come right before it, is an interesting bantamweight fight between Rafael Assunção and Cody Garbrandt. So Garbrandt's coming off of a 3-fight losing streak. Prior to that, he had been the UFC bantamweight champion. Assunção is a guy who's always been hanging around the top 5 at bantamweight, but when he's had his chances to break through, hasn't quite done it. Had a fight with TJ Dillashaw at UFC 200 and lost pretty convincingly there. Had another fight with Marlon Moraes that likely would have led to a title fight for him against Cejudo. Lost convincingly there. So he's got a good fight here where he's kind of going to play that gatekeeper role, where if he gets the win, he's probably not going to find himself in the title picture anytime soon. But if the guy who he's fighting gets a dominant win over him, he may find himself there pretty quickly. So for Garbrandt, as I mentioned in the past, and I talked about this fight on the last episode, for Garbrandt, his technique and his like his abilities, his technique, his physical attributes, specifically his speed, should put him in a position where he can win this fight. It's just one of those things where you could have said the same about his prior fights that he got knocked out in as well, but he would just kind of like let his head, or I don't know whether you'd say let his head, but he would definitely let his ego get in the way, and he would turn fights that should have been technical fights for him. He would turn those into brawls, and when he just started swinging wildly rather than staying tight and using his good boxing fundamentals, he'd get himself in trouble. Now, if he can keep his head cool here in this fight with Assunção, and just fight this as a nice technical boxing fight. He should definitely have the advantage over Sun Tzu, and he should definitely be able to get the win there. Sun Tzu does hit hard. He's able to find his spots, even against some pretty good strikers like Marlon Moraes. Though he lost his last fight to Moraes, his first fight with Moraes that he got the win in was very good, showed very good boxing. So do I think that Sun Tzu is going to be able to take Garbrandt down and control him on the ground? Probably not. Garbrandt's got very good wrestling. No one's really ever been able to take him down and control him on the ground. So I don't see that being a path to victory for Sun Tzu. On the feet, Sun Tzu can definitely land hard, and he can hit hard. We've seen Garbrandt have some trouble with some of the harder hitters in the division. So though that is a path to victory for him, I think if Garbrandt treats this like a sparring session, treats it like a session where ego isn't involved, he's not worried about the fact that a bunch of people are watching, he's not worried about whatever Sun Tzu does to piss him off, and he just tries to treat this like a boxing match, this should go well for Garbrandt. But what Garbrandt's capable of and what Garbrandt's going to actually do in there, at least lately, have been two different things. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But why it's interesting that this is the co-main event is that it seems as though, or at least it seemed prior to the UFC making a bit of a weird move. I guess it's not official yet, but it's weird that this announcement came out. But it seemed as though this event was going to be a big event for bantamweights, and that the next title challenger, the guy to fight Peter Yan, is probably going to be a guy who got his hand raised on this card. And it seemed like the fight that was most likely going to lead to that was going to be the third fight on the card, that being Aljamain Sterling versus Corey Sandhagen. So it's interesting that a Sun Tzu versus Garbrandt's the co-main event, because that sort of makes it seem as though that's the bigger fight, or that's the more important fight in the bantamweight division. So again, maybe the UFC thinks that Garbrandt's going to get a dominant win here, and that they could push him towards the top and push him into the title picture really quickly. That seems to be what's being said there by that card placement. But with that being said, in terms of merit, Aljamain Sterling and Corey Sandhagen definitely deserve to be in that title picture ahead of both the Sun Tzu and Garbrandt at this moment. But Sterling and Sandhagen are going to be fighting as well. So that's going to be a really interesting fight, where in some ways it's going to kind of a very vague way to describe it would be striker versus grappler, and that you would figure that Sandhagen's going to want this fight to stay on the feet, and Sterling's going to want to get this fight to the ground. Now, obviously, both of these guys are very well-rounded. Sandhagen's a very good grappler. Sterling striking has improved a lot over time. He's a very long fighter for the division and has been very effective at using that reach, especially in that Pedro Munoz fight. Munoz is a very good boxer, and Sterling did a good job of keeping him at bay with kicks, doing a good job with his push kicks, also doing a good job throwing out the long jab and keeping him at a distance. So for Sterling, it'll be interesting to see if he decides to try to keep this fight on the feet, and see if he can just kind of play that same type of game he played with that he played with Pedro Munoz, where he's just kind of punching away at a distance and not pointing him, or if he's going to try to mix it up, get in tight, score some takedowns on Sandhagen, and then be able to advance position on the ground and potentially get a submission finish, or at least be able to dominate some rounds on top. Fight before that, we have an interesting welterweight fight between Neil Magny and Anthony Rocco Martin. And then the first fight on the card is going to be Eddie Wineland versus Sean O'Malley, a fight that I talked about a lot last week, as one where I think Sean O'Malley is definitely a much bigger favorite than he probably should be here. But as I mentioned, I have personal bias in it, and I'm very interested to see how it works out. On the prelims, we got Alex Caceres versus Chase Hooper. So interesting card in that you got Chase Hooper and Sean O'Malley, two guys who both had a lot of hype coming off the Contender Series. As I mentioned with the Hooper-Caceres fight, again, I mentioned this one last week, but I'll mention it again. This sort of seems like they're trying to do the same thing they did with Kron Gracie, where they had Kron Gracie come in and just do a better job with his jiu-jitsu than Caceres. Caceres is decent jiu-jitsu, but obviously he's not at the level of Kron. Not to say that Chase Hooper's at the level of Kron, but Chase Hooper's background is Brazilian jiu-jitsu. The success he's had so far in his career has largely been as a result of his jiu-jitsu. His striking definitely has a lot of work. In that last fight that he had against Tamer, was having a lot of trouble on the feet prior to being able to get the fight to the ground and eventually get the finish on the ground. So the plan here for Hooper would be to sort of do something similar to what Kron Gracie did, and being able to take Caceres down, get to a dominant position, whether that's the mount or the back, really quickly, and then be able to get a finish from there. So it'll be interesting to see if this matchup plays out in a similar fashion to the Kron Gracie matchup, even though Kron Gracie's jiu-jitsu is definitely at a higher level than Chase Hooper. You figure the game plan would still be pretty similar for Hooper. Then we have Ian Hainish versus Gerald Meerschaert. So a pretty interesting fight there. I believe it's going to be at middleweight. So Hainish, I think, just recently left Factory X. So it'll be interesting to see how he does with his new camp. And then Meerschaert, always a tough guy and a staple of Rufus Sport up in Milwaukee. Then we've got Cody Stamen versus Brian Kelleher. I think this fight's going to be a featherweight. Stamen normally is a bantamweight. He had a couple recent fights at bantamweight. trying to think. He had the win over Song Yadong. He also had that loss to Aljamain Sterling where he got caught in that Sulov stretch. Kelleher has also been a bantamweight. Kelleher had wanted to take a fight against Sean O'Malley, so it's interesting to see that Kelleher and O'Malley are going to be on the same card. But Kelleher is going to be up at 145 rather than at 135 as normal. And then we have Charles Burr versus Maki Pitolo. On the early prelims, they have Jussier Formiga versus Alex Perez. Kind of crazy that this is going to be an early prelim, given that this is a high-ranked matchup at flyweight. We've also got Alonzo Menafield versus Devin Clark, and then Herbert Burns will be fighting Evan Dunham, I believe at a catchweight at 150. Going to be a tough fight for Herbert Burns. Herbert's got very good jiu-jitsu, much like his brother. He doesn't have the same level of accomplishment as Gilbert does in the Brazilian jiu-jitsu world, but at least for Brazilian jiu-jitsu and MMA, Herbert Burns is excellent. His striking, though, is not very close to the same level as Gilbert's. Doesn't hit as hard, and technically isn't quite as good. Now, with that being said, he did land a really nice knee on Nate Landwehr and was able to get a finish that way, but from what I've seen up to this point, his striking has definitely been a liability for him. Evan Dunham's very solid grappler, really good black belt on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school. So if this fight does go to the ground, I'd figure that though Burns can definitely catch Dunham and can get a finish, I think that Dunham's going to be defensively sound enough to avoid that, and I think on the feet, Dunham has a pretty big advantage on Burns. So I would definitely pick him to win this fight, assuming that all is well with him and there aren't like any outlying injuries heading into this fight, or that like taking it on short notice isn't going to be a big problem for him. So that covers it for UFC 250. Next topic to talk about is going to be a handful of different fights. So one fight that was just recently announced is Curtis Blaydes versus Alexander Volkov to headline the card on June 20th. So it's going to be interesting to see Curtis Blaydes back in action. He's sort of stuck in this tough position where the heavyweight division isn't moving forward a lot at the top of the division. Stipe and DC have been matched up as the title fight for quite a while, whether it was for the second fight that they had with each other. And then ever since then, that's been the fight that they've been trying to make ever since, but the fight hasn't been made yet. So it's put Francis Ngannou in limbo, but it's also put Curtis Blaydes in limbo, in that it seems like right now, in terms of the pecking order, you have DC and Stipe. So ideally, Stipe is going to get the win there, DC will retire, and then you'd have Stipe at the top of the hill, then you would have Ngannou as the clear number 2, and then Curtis Blaydes would be the clear number 3. That seems to be how everything's kind of set up right now, but for Curtis Blaydes, he can't get a title fight because the title's locked up. He can't fight Ngannou again to take his number 1 contender spot because he's already fought Ngannou twice and lost both times. So for him, he just kind of has to keep busy, and a guy in Volkov, who I believe is ranked number 7 right now, is a good fight for him to keep busy. For Volkov, it's a good fight for him to put his name in the title picture, especially since he hasn't yet fought Ngannou. He hasn't yet fought against Stipe. He hasn't yet fought against DC. If he does get a win over Curtis Blaydes here, assuming he wants the fight, he could definitely earn himself a spot against Francis Ngannou, who's still looking for a dance partner. After that win over Rosenstruck, there really weren't a whole lot of people at heavyweight that he was going to fight, other than for a title, depending on how the negotiations between Stipe and DC worked out. But for him, it seems unlikely that the John Jones fight's going to happen, especially with Jones and the UFC feuding even more than they had been before over their negotiations. So if Volkov's able to get a win here, it seems like a next fight for him would be against Ngannou, and again, if he gets that win there, then all of a sudden he's got himself in a title fight. For Curtis Blaydes, because he's kind of in that clear number 3 spot right now, or clear number 4 if you want to throw DC in there, even though DC is going to retire after his next fight, it's not like he really moves forward a whole lot with a win here, but it keeps him where he's at, and I guess moving forward, if Volkov puts together a nice little streak, it's good to have that win over Volkov before that streak gets started, to at least say that you still belong ahead of him in the pecking order. As far as how I think the fight will go, Volkov's definitely going to have the advantage on the feet. Pretty good at staying long and keeping people off of him. In terms of how it's going to look, it's tough because you think about the Volkov versus Verdum fight, where Volkov was going up against a guy who's a better grappler than him, who wanted to take him down. Now, obviously, Verdum's wrestling is nowhere near that of Curtis Blaydes, especially in an MMA context. One of the really interesting things about Blaydes compared to most heavyweight wrestlers is that Blaydes doesn't need to just like box you up against the fence, clinch you up, and then drag you down off the fence. Like he'll shoot in the middle of the octagon and take you down off of a shot, and it definitely makes him a lot more dangerous of a wrestler than most other guys, especially someone like Fabricio Verdum, who doesn't really double leg people in the middle of the octagon. So though Volkov was pretty successful in keeping Verdum off of him, picking him apart on the feet and then keeping him from taking him down, though Verdum's a better striker than Curtis Blaydes is, Blaydes having that threat of the double leg in the middle of the octagon, you would think is going to make a big difference here. For Volkov, you're going to want to keep this fight at range, but again, over the course of 25 minutes, it's not going to be able to do that. It's not going to be easy to do that the whole time. Volkov, when he was on the ground with Verdum, was pretty positionally sound, didn't give up a whole lot of bad positions, so you'd figure that if Curtis Blades does take him down, it's not like Volkov's going to be lost on the ground and it's going to immediately get mounted, give up his back, and be done. But with that being said, Blades is still very good with his ground and pound, even if he's just in your guard. Still really good with the elbows and still really good at landing a lot of damaging shots. So I'm going to be interested to see how Blades is going to go about setting up his takedowns, how successful he's going to be in doing that, and if he does get the fight to the ground, how much damage can he do and how effective can he be on top of Volkov. But for the most part, based off what I've seen from Blades in the past, based off what I expected from Blades' opponents in the past, I feel like I have to give Blades the edge here and assume that he is going to be successful in getting the fight to the ground once he does get it to the ground. Even if he's not able to immediately pass to dominant positions, he'll still find elbows, whether it's from a fully closed guard, whether it's from half guard, and with the damage he does there, he'll then be able to kind of parlay that damage and be able to advance position. Whether he gets a finish or not, it's going to be hard to say, but I think he should be pretty dominant. Next fight that has, I guess technically this hasn't been announced yet in terms of an actual date, but it sounds like this is what the UFC wants to do, and I don't know why they would make this announcement or why this would even get leaked, is the idea of putting Peter Yan and Jose Aldo in there for a title fight. If this is what the UFC wants to do, okay, that's fine. Like, I get it. If you're going to have someone walk away with a title, having Jose Aldo walk away with the bantamweight title isn't the worst thing for you. Having Peter Yan walk away with the title after beating Jose Aldo is a good look for Peter Yan. So if that's the fight you want to make, look, Aldo never really lost his title shot. It was a pandemic that caused him to have to give up that spot. If the UFC feels like, hey, we're still going to give Aldo the title shot, we're still going to honor that, then okay, that's fine. But don't let that come out before you have an event where you've got two giant bantamweight fights on the main card. Like, even if they don't actually plan to put the winner of the Assunção versus Garbrandt fight or the winner of the Sterling versus Sandhagen fight, even if you don't plan to put them in the title fight against Yan, if you can just so much as say, hey, we're going to be watching these fights closely, and depending on the results, we may put the winner into a title fight, that definitely makes those fights a lot more interesting, and it makes it a lot more exciting this coming weekend than if we all know going in that even if Sandhagen knocks out Sterling in 10 seconds, or even if Garbrandt puts on a vintage performance against Assunção, that they're not going to get title fights. We don't need to know that right now, and it's probably not the most helpful thing for the UFC to have that come out. So it's weird that this did come out, but if that's the fight they're going to go with, I'm okay with it. Get it out of the way. Even if we do get a really impressive performance out of one of these guys here on Saturday, June 6th, if you do a fight in July for the title between Yan and Aldo, it's not as though we would expect the winner of one of these fights on UFC 250 to be ready by July. So if you're going to put a fight in July and then say that the winner on one of these cards gets the title shot maybe in October, that's okay, but it just doesn't seem like a good idea to have this announcement come out ahead of time, because the UFC 250 card isn't a terribly strong card to begin with. You only have one title fight on it. It's better to at least have the illusion that you're going to have a title fight and a title eliminator than just one title fight and some good fights in a solid division. So it seems odd that came out, but that's a fight that seems to be in the works. And then one more fight announcement was for July 25th. It's going to be Robert Whittaker versus Daren Till at middleweight, which is going to be a very interesting fight. Till, technically speaking, should be the better striker than Whittaker, but Whittaker is obviously very dangerous at middleweight. You'd figure that he's going to try not to make some of the similar mistakes that he made against Israel Adesanya, but in terms of picking this fight, it's going to be tough, because over the course of 25 minutes, like what we saw with that Till versus Gastelum fight, I think a lot of people coming in just assumed that Gastelum would be able to blitz forward, land on Till, and be able to take him out, similar to how Masvidal was able to take him out. It didn't happen. Till was just very technical the entire time, picked his spots, and was able to just outpoint Gastelum, similar to how he was able to beat Stephen Thompson as well. You figure if that's the style that Daren Till wants to fight against Robert Whittaker, he's probably going to be able to get the win here. Is that style going to lend to him finding himself in the title picture anytime soon? I don't know about that. I think getting dominant wins is something that helps out. Now, granted, Daren Till is a pretty big star, especially in Liverpool. So for him, because he has that big appeal, he doesn't necessarily need to win as impressively as maybe someone else who doesn't have that entire nation behind him. But to me, how this fight's going to go is going to be largely dependent on how Daren Till wants this fight to go. If Daren Till wants to just pick his shots and try to outpoint Robert Whittaker, I think he's going to be able to do that. But if he tries to open things up and make this a more exciting fight, then obviously that's going to create openings for Robert Whittaker, where Whittaker can land some heavy shots on him, possibly drop him, and then possibly get the finish. So to me, this fight's going to come down to tactics. But it seems as though Daren Till, if he wants to win this fight in a tactical manner, has the skills and has the ability to do so. Next topic to talk about is a big story at 170 pounds. So Colby Covington has decided to leave American Top Team. Recently, ATT was putting some rules in place where ATT fighters couldn't talk trash about each other, and it didn't seem as though Colby was interested in following those rules. From what he said in interviews, it's pretty much that he has a lot of respect for Dan Lambert. Lambert was kind of put in a tough position as the owner of ATT, where he had to please a bunch of people who didn't like each other. And that out of respect to Lambert, rather than like having to force him in the middle of all the drama, he was just going to leave and do his own thing, but him and Lambert could still be friends and still be friendly. So on his way out, even though Colby likes to talk trash about pretty much everyone, wasn't talking any trash about Lambert, still has a lot of respect for Dan Lambert, but was definitely taking shots at Jorge Masvidal and was taking shots at Dustin Poirier. Was angling for a fight with Jorge Masvidal as well, which is interesting that Masvidal's in the spot now where he's got 3 really interesting fights that he could possibly take. He could take the title fight against Kamaru Usman. He could take the rematch against Nate Diaz, which would seem like the easiest route for him to go, and one that would be very lucrative given how lucrative the first one was. And he could also take the fight with Colby Covington, which from a grudge standpoint would be the most interesting one, and from a technique standpoint would be pretty interesting as well. So where he goes from here, it's going to be hard to tell, but for Colby, if he can get that Masvidal matchup, that's probably the one you want to make right now. Masvidal has a couple other options. I don't know that he's going to get the Masvidal option, especially since Masvidal can either take a title fight or take a fight that he's very likely to get a pretty easy win in. So if I'm Masvidal, I'm probably not taking the Colby fight right now. So where that leave Colby? Colby's going to need to set up a camp right now. He's got some friends in the area, but it's not like he has a gym set up, so he's probably going to want to have some kind of gym set up, whether it's just like a garage gym that he has at home and he just has a bunch of training partners that come over and that's how he gets his training in, or whether he just sets up a gym of his own and just kind of works things out that way. So it'll be interesting to see how his training situation works out from here. He's not moving, so if you're a top fighter and you're in that Miami-Dade County area, you're probably going to want to train at ATT or train at Sanford/Hard Knocks. So it's not as though Colby Covington's going to have a great pull other than the fact that you can train with Colby himself there. He's got some friends from ATT who I'm sure will still be coming over and training with him as well. But it'll really be interesting to see what he plans on doing here, because if the plan is not for him to leave Miami, then he's going to be in a spot where a lot of the best guys are going to be training at bigger gyms that offer more to them than whatever Colby Covington can create. So that'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see if the quality of his training goes down significantly as a result. A lot of the cardio that he does, he can still do on his own. But as far as who he gets his rounds in with, he's not going to have as many options as he had with ATT. His coaching, again, if he's able to like get some, if he's going to be able to pay some ATT coaches to like come over to his place and like do that as like a side gig for them, then I guess he'll be fine. But I'm really going to be interesting to see how Colby gets this all to work out, who he's able to bring in, and how his training looks as a result. But for him, like I mentioned before, the fight that seems to be the most interesting right now would be that fight with Tyron Woodley. It seems like there's no better time than now for Colby to take a fight with Tyron, in terms of it being a winnable fight for Colby. And from a matchup standpoint, you don't want Tyron to be on a 3-fight losing streak heading into the Colby fight. Like, you don't want that fight to come when they're both on a super duper cold streak. Like, granted, they're both coming off of losses now, but you don't want them to be both looking really bad when they finally fight each other. You want there still to be some meaning where the winner can actually go somewhere and put themselves in the title picture with a win. Next topic to talk about is who's number one, which is that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu event that's going to be on Flow Grappling. So in their main event, they're going to have Kyle Boehm from 10th Planet going against Gordon Ryan. Kyle Boehm, recent black belt from 10th Planet, has done pretty well in some tournaments. Has competed at Submission Underground. He also won the BJJ Fanatics Black Belt Invitational. Beat Lucas Holt Barboza, who I'm pretty sure is a black belt world champion, in the finals. Now, granted, that was under EBI rules. This will not be under EBI rules, though it will be a sub-only no time limit match between him and Gordon Ryan. So for Gordon, it's going to be interesting in that he's fighting someone that he hasn't fought before. You'd figure he should have a pretty big edge here, but again, this is no-gi Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in a sub-only format. Gordon Ryan's going to have a pretty big advantage over just about everyone in that situation, so you'd figure he'll get the win here, but it's going to be interesting to see him take on a new matchup and a guy in Kyle Boehm who's beaten some pretty good guys recently. In the co-main event, at 170 pounds, we have his brother, Nicky Ryan, who really hasn't competed as much as I would have expected him to be competing right around now. I don't know if injuries have played a factor. He did compete at ADCC, but he's been nowhere near as active as his brother. Part of that could just be that John Danaher wants him to get some more work in the training room and really get him improved to a much higher level before they start getting him out there. Because it seems like, at least on the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu scene, once you start competing against some of the top guys, like, they're just going to keep pushing you out against harder and harder guys until they can find someone who can beat you. So maybe the idea is that there's still some holes they want to clean up in Nicky Ryan's game before they get him going out on the scene, and maybe they feel like they're getting pretty close to that moment right now. But Nicky Ryan will be facing Ruotolo, who finished 4th at ADCC in the same bracket that Nicky Ryan was in. Ruotolo was looking really good in that bracket too. The guy who beat Nicky Ryan was Paul Miao, former black belt world champion, multiple-time black belt world champion. Ended up finishing 3rd at ADCC. Miao won that by points. I think he beat him by a score of 2-0. Ruotolo had a pretty close match with Miao in that 3rd place match. Had a really tight knee bar that looked as though he definitely damaged. He definitely damaged Paul Miao's knee, but Miao is a guy who just doesn't tap to pretty much anything. You pretty much have to choke him unconscious if you actually want to get a win by submission against him. He just lets his joints go. Kind of a crazy dude in that way, especially for a guy who's won multiple championships. It seemed like there was no need for him to give up his knee to win an ADCC bronze medal, but he was willing to do that and was able to get the win over Ruotolo. But Ruotolo is a really dangerous kid, really young himself. I think he's like 18. So for this matchup, it's going to be really interesting. You got two guys, one from the East Coast with Nicky Ryan, one from the West Coast with Ruotolo, who are both grappling prodigies in their own right and are both going to be really dangerous moving forward. Both guys who I think a lot of people expect to do a lot of great things in the years ahead. So maybe in 2020, this matchup between Ruotolo and Ryan isn't going to be the most attention-grabbing, but I feel like in a few years from now, if you tell people that Nicky Ryan and Ruotolo had a match, they're going to be like, oh, God, I got to see that. That sounds awesome, because both of these guys are just killing it right now. Match before that, we have Ruotolo's twin brother, who's also an excellent Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitor, Cade Ruotolo. He'll be facing Ethan Krellinston, who also comes from Team Renzo Gracie. So back-to-back, you have matches between John Danaher students and Atos standouts, guys who train under Andre Galvao. Kind of a shame that the main event wasn't going to Ryan versus Andre Galvao, but it seems like that's one that we might be seeing at ADCC if they can offer up enough money to get Andre Galvao to take that match. We've also got Cody Steele versus Alec Balding, and then some other pretty solid matchups throughout the card. Like I said before, it's not clear if there are going to be more matches announced later on. But if this is the card that we have right now, it's still a pretty strong card and some pretty good matchups at the top of it. So that brings me to the final topic, and I'll start off, and again, this is the George Floyd topic. I'll start off just my take on the video itself as someone who does jiu-jitsu, and then I'll get into some of the more political stuff afterwards. Again, like I said, if you just want to hear about sports, if you don't want to hear MMA guys' take on politics, feel free to cut it off right here. I don't blame you for it. I'm not mad at anyone who doesn't want to hear my take on it. Part of the reason why I got into making my own podcast and doing my own videos on this is because I got sick and tired of a lot of the mainstream MMA guys who felt like they needed to use their notoriety in MMA to build some notoriety in politics as well. So in a way, I'm sort of like doing what I dislike here, and that I'm going to be giving my own take on it. But I feel like, at least by giving you guys the heads up that that's what's about to happen, by putting it at the end, by putting all the MMA stuff first, and giving you the opportunity to listen to that, rather than having to cut out 10 minutes in the middle and then come back later to get the rest of the MMA stuff. I feel like I'm being as fair about this as I can. So first off, from a jiu-jitsu standpoint, looking at the video, if you're talking about a choke, so there's a couple different ways to finish a choke. There is the air choke and there's the blood choke. The air choke, obviously, is you're effectively suffocating someone where they can't get any oxygen anymore, and once they're no longer able to breathe, then they eventually go unconscious. Air chokes take a long time. There's a reason why you can hold your breath in a pool for, even if you're really nervous, you can probably hold your breath underwater for at least 30 seconds, but there are people who can hold their breath underwater for a couple minutes at a time if they keep calm and hang on to the breath they have. So for jiu-jitsu, air chokes, though they exist, like you'll see Fagner Rocha, who will get someone's back, trap an arm, and then with one arm he'll trap the other arm, and then with one hand he'll just kind of smother their mouth and eventually get a tap that way. There's also this mother's milk submission, which you see a lot. You don't see it a lot, but some big guys can do it, where they just kind of suffocate someone with their chest. So that's one way to choke someone. Another way, and the more common way, is the blood choke, which is where you're constricting both carotid arteries so that the blood doesn't get to the brain, and then that one will put someone out pretty quickly. If you have it in really tight, it might only take a few seconds, and then they'll be unconscious. So for this knee on neck position, he wasn't doing anything to block the airway. It is worth mentioning that Floyd was on his belly And with that being said, it's tough for the lungs to fully expand and then contract when you're being shoved down stomach first. So breathing definitely played a factor in there, but the knee on neck wasn't necessarily doing anything to constrict the breathing, more so than the other cop who was on his chest pressing down into the ground. As for the knee on neck, the knee can definitely cover one carotid artery. The question then would be what's blocking the other one. It was tough to tell from the video. There were definitely some positions where it looked like the ground was taking one side of the neck and then the knee was taking the other side, so there could have definitely been a blood choke there. As far as the I can't breathe thing goes, I think that was mostly him referencing that he had his chest and his stomach being pressed down in the ground and that he wasn't able to expand it because there was so much weight on top of his back. So I think that's what he was referencing there. He did eventually go unconscious and then was later pronounced dead. From the medical examiner's report, they were saying that he wasn't choked to death, that it was something that was caused by him having some heart condition as well. I don't know what to make of that because, let's face it, is it likely true that a completely healthy person, if put in the same exact situation, isn't going to die? I think there's a decent chance that they survive. But with that being said, like, this guy probably is going to live in most situations. And first off, if you're a cop, the entire goal of what you're doing there is you want to immobilize the suspect, and then once you got him immobilized, then you want to get him into your cop car, transport him to the jail, and then get him processed. Like, the idea isn't like once you immobilize him, that you just keep him there forever. And to me, the unquestionable thing about this video, before we even get into talking about whether or not he was choked to death, the unquestionable thing is that the cops had no reason to keep him there that long. They had no reason to continue to go knee on neck. The knee on neck didn't do anything. If you're trying to immobilize the guy and you already have him handcuffed, at that point, like, the only real danger is his feet. It's not as though if you have control of his hands and you have control of his feet that he's going to, like, flip up onto his head and just, like, start doing, like, some coffee grinder or some other, like, breakdancing movement and just, like, find his way out of there. Like, there's pretty much nowhere for him to go, especially if you have control of his legs. So for them to be kneeing on his back, that wasn't very necessary. For them to... There was a guy who had him by the feet, which, again, that's fine. So for the knee on the neck, there's literally no functional need for it. And it seems like one of the things that's really annoying about this is that you get the feeling that the cop who had the knee on the neck, like, because people were filming him, he kind of, like, dug his heels into the point where he's like... You almost wonder, like, if nobody saw this, if he would have, like, taken his knee off the neck a lot sooner and they would have just, like, moved him in the back of the squad car. Or if it was one of those things where, like, he had the knee on the neck momentarily, people were telling him to get off, and he's like, no, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to stay here until I feel like it. And that, like, as a result, he kind of just, like, dug his heels and just clearly did the wrong thing because he was just being an arrogant dick who didn't want to feel like he was being told what to do by civilians. But either way, there was no need for him to be there that long. They had him immobilized. They had him immobilized for a while. Once you got him immobilized, you got to get him in the back of the cop car. There's also some story that came out that they had him in the cop car to begin with, and they took him out, and then, like, were like holding him down afterwards. If you've already got him in the back of the squad car, fucking go. Like, go off to the station, get it taken care of, and be done with it. But clearly, there's pretty much nothing that this George Floyd guy could have done that would warrant him being killed. Like, even if you find the worst stuff about him, even if you find that he did something bad in the past, even if, I mean, fuck, even if he would have, like, punched the cops, even if he would have, like, spit on them, even if he would have, like, called them bad names or told them that he hates their family, like, that does not excuse him being killed. There is no reason he should have been killed here. And really, even beyond the kill, like, once he was immobilized, you don't need to fucking stay on his neck. There was no need for that. So whether or not he was choked to death by the cop with the knee on the neck, which is a different argument, what was done by the cops was completely unnecessary. And from everything I've seen, everyone agrees on that. And I think that's one of the worst things about this situation, is that based on the video, whether you're conservative, whether you're liberal, no matter where you come from, I did not find anyone who's like, yeah, no, the cops did the right thing here. No one said that. No one was cool with the cop who kept his knee on the neck. No one was cool with the cops who ignored the guy's pleas. Nobody was cool with it. It was one of those moments where it was kind of like where you had everyone initially united on it, where they're like, yeah, this is wrong, this shouldn't happen. The problem is that different interpretations of what happened then created division to the point where we're at now, where we just have riots in states that are thousands of miles away that just don't make any sense and don't even apply to it. And I think that's where things are really unfortunate. So before I get into that, just back to whether or not I think he was choked to death, it does look like towards the end, especially with the position of the knee, that it's very possible that there was a blood choke there that could have put him out and eventually put him away, and then at that point he's still keeping his knee there. If the medical examiner determined it wasn't a blood choke that killed it, I mean, they have more information than I do, but it does look definitely plausible that given the position of where the knee was on one of the carotid arteries and given where the neck was just kind of like shoved into the pavement, it's definitely possible that there was a blood choke that put him out, and then you hold on to a blood choke for too long, and obviously you can kill someone, and that seems like that is a possibility of what happened here. Now, is the knee on neck position like a terrible position that should never happen? I think one of the things that annoys me is that whether it was like that Michael, or I don't think it was Michael Brown, it was Eric Garner. Whether it was the Eric Garner position or this, it seems like a lot of people who don't understand chokeholds at all, they just hate the idea of seeing a chokehold, so they thought that Eric Garner got choked to death because someone had a brief rear naked choke on him. And there was this thought that like having the knee on neck is like this super dangerous position that can kill someone. From a jiu-jitsu standpoint, rear naked chokes, if you have them fully locked in, you're allowed to do it. And you know, if you watch it closely, most people are going to be okay. You can have a fully locked in rear naked choke for a brief period of time on someone in a jiu-jitsu tournament. You can have it locked in for a brief period of time, even in a training situation, and the expectation of death just isn't there. I've had rear naked chokes locked in tight on me. I've locked in tight rear naked chokes, much tighter than what we saw in that Eric Garner situation, and death wasn't involved, and no one had to go to the hospital. Like, it was never even close to being that bad. So honestly, I think chokes probably should be, if administered by someone who knows what they're doing, chokes would probably be a great tool for cops to have. It's just that a lot of these cops are very poorly trained, which is a separate situation that I'll get back to. But I actually think that chokes should be used a lot more than they are. So just the thought of a cop choking someone being like this terrible idea, actually I don't think it's a bad idea at all. I think that chokes would be very useful for them and can definitely get the job done a lot more effectively than what they're currently doing. As far as the knee on neck situation goes, you can do knee on neck in jiu-jitsu tournaments. There are some tournaments where it's illegal, especially at lower belts, but there are a lot of tournaments where it is legal. Sometimes you can use it for chokes, especially if you can get a lapel grip where you'll have the knee on one neck, so you're blocking the artery with one neck, or you're blocking one artery with your knee, and then the other artery you're attacking by grabbing the lapel on the other side. So you can use it as a choking position, and you can also just use it as a position of pain, just to be a dick. Although most people don't do that in the room because your training partners will hate you if you do that. And in tournaments, I guess you can do it every so often, but you got a time limit on the tournament. So it's not that the knee on neck position, at least over a brief period of time, is like this awful position that a cop should never be able to use. I think it actually is a standard position that they're trained for, but it's not one that you're supposed to hang on to for fucking 10 minutes or however long he did, especially not if the guy's unresponsive and you're still hanging on to it for a couple minutes beyond that. So as far as the positions go, do I have a problem with cops choking people? If they know what they're doing, no, I don't. I actually think it's a pretty effective thing that they could be doing. Do I have a problem with a knee on neck? Again, briefly, that's something you can do. It kind of depends on the specific situation. If you're going knee on neck on someone who isn't moving, who isn't resisting, who already is handcuffed and is on their belly, there's no fucking need for that. But there definitely could be times where knee on neck is applicable, but this specific one was not one of those. Okay, so like I mentioned, the possible good story out of this, which there isn't a whole lot of good, but the possible good was that we have the situation now where there's a video where people on both sides of the aisle who typically disagree can all come in agreement that this cop was out of line. These cops who were all accomplices were all out of line. And from there, you can say, okay, well, we've got an agreement here. What do we want to do to try to fix this? The small fix, obviously, is going to be justice specifically for George Floyd. So that means you're going to have the officers who were involved. They're obviously fired, but then beyond that, you're going to look to pursue criminal charges. That's where we're at right now. So at least the cop with the knee on neck, he's arrested and is facing charges of third-degree murder. I don't know what they're planning on doing with the other cops who are accomplices, but they definitely hold some responsibility here as well. They've been fired at the very least, but it'll be interesting to see where they go from there. So that's half of it. But the other half is then, how do we make sure something like this doesn't happen again? And as far as not making it happen again, to me, I feel like I need to know more about how cops are trained. In most situations and for most jobs, whether you're looking to get into marketing, accounting, engineering, if you're looking to be a doctor, you've at least got, definitely, this is not for a doctor, but, well, I guess it's along the way for a doctor, but for most, you got to get a 4-year degree. You have to have, like, which is effectively 4 years of training prior to getting into that career field. And for cops, I'm not exactly sure what the training is for them. They obviously have police academies, but I don't know how long it goes. But with jiu-jitsu, even if you're kind of a slow learner and you train like 3 times a week, after 2 years, you're probably going to get a blue belt. And assuming that you're giving a cop at least 2 years of training before they become a cop, if not 4, the idea of them putting in enough training to get to a blue belt level of competency doesn't seem like that's crazy. There was some talk of Andrew Yang wanting all cops to be purple belts. I mean, in some places it's hard enough to get cops as is. Putting on requirements that require a purple belt, which if you're really training hard and you love jiu-jitsu, 4 years is sometimes not enough to get it. So I don't know if that's fair, but a blue belt should definitely be fair. If you're already a cop, I'm not saying that you have to be like held off the force until you get your blue belt, but that's something you can do moving forward, where if you're already a cop, then you're grandfathered and you still have your job, but the expectation is that within, say, 2.5, 3 years that you have your blue belt by then, at which point every cop would be required to have a blue belt, but then the new ones coming in, you want to at least like get them at that level of proficiency. But this is one of those situations where if you understand how to manipulate a human body, how to control a human body, you understand how unnecessary it is to fucking put a knee on a guy's neck when he's already controlled. You understand that if the hands are taken away, if the elbows are pretty much taken away, then that's a whole set of posts that are gone. The other posts would be like the knees and the feet. But again, if you control that, which you can, then the guy can still breathe. You can drag him back up to his feet, put him in the back of the squad car, and then get him processed. So, to me, a big issue here is that cops aren't properly trained, and that's leading them to them making a lot of errors where there really shouldn't be errors. And one of the downsides too is that there's this just gross desire in the United States to make every time a cop does something wrong to make it a race issue. Where if a black cop does something wrong to a black person, it's like, well, the black person got abused by the cops, so we kind of have to cover this, but it is a black cop. If a white cop does something bad to a white person, then you pretty much never hear about that. And a colored cop does something to a white person, you pretty much never hear about that. But when you have the perfect mixture of the white cop doing something bad to a black person, oh my God, like let's blast this out everywhere. Let's make sure everyone sees it. Let's not even like mention these people by name. Let's just make sure that the cop's name is white cop and the black person's name is black man. And let's make sure everyone sees that story and make it a race issue. And that's what this has become. Because the crazy thing that you'll see, and you'll see these online, is that some of the worst videos I've seen in terms of cops just completely abusing their power and doing a shit job, it's been to white people. So there was this example, I believe the guy's name was Daniel Shaver, but he was this drunk white guy who was in a hotel room. Apparently the cops had got called on him because he was like shooting a BB gun out of the window. But he's on the hotel floor, guy's drunk, sobbing, and the cop's like, don't move, like, do exactly what I tell you to do or else I'm going to shoot you. But the guy was just completely following orders. But he was drunk, and as he had his hands up and he was like trying to crawl towards the cop, he stumbles over. Clearly it wasn't any threat to the cop, but the cop just fucking executes him point blank range with I believe it was like a military style rifle. I don't know if it was like a single shot or if it was a fully auto gun. I think it was a single shot. I think he just kind of like took 3 trigger pulls on it. But either way, just killed the guy right there who was like sobbing, was clearly trying to be compliant, and just shot him dead. But he had white cop versus white guy, so though that was way worse of a video than what we saw with George Floyd, you hardly ever heard about that, and you're only really hearing about it again now because people are talking about George Floyd. But again, it didn't fit that racial component, so people didn't make a story out of it, when in reality the issue there was just a poorly trained person who was just completely amped up on adrenaline and made a just awful decision and ended up killing a man. There's another situation, I think the guy, I forgot what the guy's name was, it was something that sounded Italian, but it was a white guy in Dallas who was pretty much in the exact same position as George Floyd, where he went unconscious, and you saw like the body cam footage of the cops like still staying on top of him, like joking about him, oh, you sleepy, oh, gotta wake up, time to go to school. Like they were like making all these kind of jokes. It was pretty much just the George Floyd situation, except the cops were like joking at his expense the entire time. But again, you never hear that story because, again, the victim is white. But now in this case, we have that black victim with the white cop, and now it's a situation of, oh, it's got to be racism. Like the only reason why this happened is racism. It's not anything else. It's racism. And to me, there's definitely an argument to be had that cops need to be trained better. That if you do have that training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or something similar, that not only are you going to be able to handle situations better, and the more trained you are, the less force you have to use to effectively take a situation and de-escalate it, but just the training process itself, it's therapeutic for a lot of people, and it can definitely lower an ego for someone. It just sort of like makes you have to understand the reality in terms of where you are physically versus other people. And some of these cops just, between them not knowing what to do, so they just end up having to go overboard because they can't be precise in the amount of energy output that they use to try to de-escalate a situation. Their lack of confidence in the ability to de-escalate a situation to the point where they feel like they have to keep their knee on a guy's neck because they don't know what's going to happen if he starts to squirm a little bit. They don't know how they're going to fucking stop him if he does. But whatever the case may be, it seems as though the real solution to this problem is better training standards for police officers. that if you have that in place, the situations like Daniel Shaver, the situations like the guy in Dallas, like, though you don't hear about them because the guy who gets killed is white, that those can be reduced significantly, and that you can also see a significant reduction in this happening to people of color as well as just generally people who are interacting with police in general. So to me, that's the biggest shame, is that no one's talking about Daniel Shaver as though he was executed because he's white, because the cop hates white people. But because George Floyd's black, it's got to be because the cop hates black people. Like, it has to be a race issue now. Like, there's no possibility to some people that what happened to George Floyd was just because the cop was overzealous, poorly trained, and was just digging his heels in because he felt like the citizens were trying to take his power away to properly handle the arrest. Like, it has to be race to these people. And because of that, when the solution becomes a race-based solution rather than a training-based solution, where you understand that it's not just black people who have been victims of this kind of stuff, you're probably not going to really get the solution you want. And so, just for those who are at least protesting peacefully, which, whether or not I agree with your solutions, if you're protesting peacefully, at least I'll give you credit for that, at least for them. If your focus just becomes a racial focus rather than a focus on the training aspect, and rather than a focus on situations where police mishandle situations like this, including those where white people are victims, including those where colored cops do it to other colored people. And when I say colored, that's just the phrases they use. I don't like to think of it in that way. I mean, I like to think of people as individuals rather than based on their skin color, but that's what this has become, so that's why I'm using that terminology. But when that's what it becomes, it just doesn't seem like you're focusing on the right thing, and if your focus is wrong, then your solution's probably not going to be correct either. So it'd be nice if people could actually focus on this from a training standpoint, and at least be able to admit, like, this isn't just something that happens to black people, and not just make the assumption that every time that a black person is hurt by a cop, that's because the cop's racist, but then ignore every time that a cop does the exact same thing or something worse to a white person, because it seems like that's kind of where we've gotten with this, and that's annoying. Now, as far as the people who are looting, one of the worst fucking takes I've heard ever is this take that's being designed to excuse the rioters, and it's this idea where it's like, oh, well, these people are expressing their pain, and looting and rioting is just the language of those in pain. I get what you're trying to say when you say that. You're trying to say, look, I understand where they're coming from. I don't want to. I don't want to be rude. I don't want to diminish them. But effectively, what you're saying is so fucking racist. It's crazy to me. Like, there's this term called the soft bigotry of low expectations, where it's kind of like when you expect less of someone just because of their skin color. Like, you're actually, like, displaying bigotry towards them. This is like the ultimate in the soft bigotry of low expectations, because effectively what you're saying is like, yeah, they're committing felonies and they're destroying their own businesses and they're destroying their own communities and some people are getting killed, but I mean, these people were just born with this terrible draw in life, and you know, you just gotta accept it. You gotta accept that black people are more violent, and their response to a bad cop in Minnesota is to destroy a community in Atlanta. You just gotta accept that. That's racist as hell. Like, I could not imagine being one of the majority, by the way. The majority of black people who are upset by this are going about this the right way. Well, again, whether or not we agree on this being a racial issue or a police training issue is separate, but most of the people here are going about this the right way. They understand the value of their communities. They don't want to see their housing projects burnt down. They don't want to see the police force burnt down. They don't want to see businesses burnt down. They don't want to see businesses looted. The majority of these people are now being lumped in with the idiots who are looting, because the people don't want to offend the looters by saying that these guys are just going completely haywire here and they're doing the wrong thing. And so there's like this idea, it's like, oh yeah, well, you know, you're black, you were born with a lot of pain. This is just how you handle things. You don't handle things maturely. You got to commit felonies, and you know, that's just how you are. That's effectively what you're saying when you use that excuse of, oh, well, you know, this is just the language of the oppressed. This rioting is the language of the oppressed. Like, that's such an absurd take. It's such a racist take. And it's just disgusting to see people try to use it as an excuse for the rioters. There's no excuse for what the looters are doing. Just because George Floyd was wronged. George Floyd's family was wronged. His friends were wronged by what happened as a result of those 4 cops. Like, that's really who this specific situation is between. For you to loot a fucking Target, for you to burn down a restaurant on the East Coast, that has absolutely nothing to do with it, and you're not solving any kind of issue. The person who you're attacking, like, they're not responsible for this. This isn't their fault. So the fact that people are trying to excuse this rioting, looting is absurd. It's racist on its face for what they're saying. But then on top of it, when you excuse it, guess what's going to happen? More people are going to do it. And it's no accident that you have a lot of people trying to excuse this looting as, oh, well, it's just the language of the oppressed, and you just keep seeing all these riots and all this looting across the country. This is something that needs to be nipped in the bud. It's not productive. And quite frankly, if your concern here is racial relations, if your concern is racism, one of the worst things you can do is tell the people who actually do have racist views, who actually do feel like black people are animals or whatever their thought process is, to actually tell them, actually, you know what, I agree with you. I agree that these are more violent people. We just need to let them be as they are. That is so fucking absurd that people are trying to push that along. And I'm telling you, the people who think they're helping by doing that, they're only making things worse. Not only are they making things worse in the meantime as these communities get destroyed and they enable it, but they're making things worse in that the people who actually are racist are going to be even deeper, like even more sure of their opinions afterwards. Because if their thought was, oh, black people are violent animals, which is an absurd thought to have, everyone's an individual. There are plenty of people of every race who are violent and uncivilized, and there are plenty of people of every race who are just wonderful people. And I hate the idea of comparing people and like making generalizations about people just based off of the color of their skin, which is something they have no control over. But to those who actually do believe that way, if you're then hearing the people who have always been like ripping on you and calling you a racist, you hear them basically making your same argument, saying, yeah, these people are more violent. Whether they think they're saying it in a nice way by saying, oh, it's the language of the oppressed, this isn't going to help long term. Like, this is going to be very damaging. So it's frustrating to see, just to see all over my country, to see what's happening to it right now. It's frustrating to see people trying to make excuses for it. Yes, is it frustrating that people seem to be focused on the wrong thing here and trying to make this a race issue rather than a police training issue, and in that way seeming as though it's going to be unlikely that they're going to get to a fix for it. Yes, that's frustrating, but I would much rather be dealing with people who are making that argument and not burning down their cities and not burning down their own businesses than those who are. And it's just crazy to see that. So hopefully there is some good that comes of this. I feel awful for the family of George Floyd. I feel awful for those who were closest to him. You're really never going to get full justice on this. I mean, even if the guy gets locked away, even if the guy gets the death penalty, which he won't, but even if that officer does, like, you're still never going to have him back. So for them, it's awful. In terms of preventing this kind of stuff in the future, though, to me, you have to start changing how cops are trained. You have to really force them to be more competent in physical altercations, and the requirements just aren't where they need to be right now. Even a lot of cops that I train with, like, they're in agreement on this as well, where they feel like what they do in going out of their way to train is something they do for their own personal enjoyment, but it definitely helps them out a lot professionally. They'd like to see more of the people that they work with do the same. Some of them don't like to do it for a handful of different reasons. Sometimes it's a time thing. Sometimes it's an ego thing where, at least on the force, you can kind of feel like, oh, you're the tough guy around there, but when you actually have to go on the mats and prove it, maybe you're a little bit worried about what's going to happen there. But if that's a requirement, and they have to train, for those whose egos are the reason why they aren't training in the first place, maybe they don't need to be on the force in the first place, but if that's something that they can get over and they can become better about that in general, then that's going to be a good thing. But to me, the fix here is more of a training fix. We're just in this weird spot, sort of like this Colin Kaepernick opinion, where cops are always all out after black people, and I'm not going to stop kneeling until this is ever fixed. Well, this situation of cops killing people is never going to be fixed, because in some situations they're actually going to have to kill people. Like, there are going to be situations where people offer a life or death threat to a police officer, and the police officer needs to be the one who goes home rather than the criminal. That was definitely not the case here with Floyd. But in situations like this, in situations like the Shaver case, in situations like the one in Dallas that I was talking about as well, where no one has to die, yet someone does, that ultimately comes down to training. More situations like this are going to keep happening if there's no adjustment to how training is. And in all likelihood, eventually, and it seems like every couple of years it happens, but eventually there's going to be another situation, assuming that training doesn't improve, where it just so happens that not only is it that the black guy becomes the victim, but that the person who perpetrated it was white. So if it's the white cop killing the white guy, that's going to go unnoticed, and it's probably going to continue to go unnoticed. If it's the black cop killing the white guy, it's probably going to go unnoticed. If it's the black cop killing the black guy, it might go unnoticed a little bit, but it's not going to hold up quite as well. But the next time we have a white cop killing a black guy, whether it's just because they were poorly trained and they were doing the wrong thing, as has been the case in many other situations, or whether people want to apply racism to it, it seems like this is just going to keep happening, and it's going to keep happening over and over. And by saying that this is just a race issue and not acknowledging the issue of training, it doesn't feel like we're going to get a solution to this, so it seems like this is going to happen again. So I would like if anything that we can get from this, if there's anything good that we can make of George Floyd having to have his life sacrificed in this way, you would hope that there are changes that are made for the better. It's a shame that at this point the agreement that potentially that there could have been between the left and the right seems to be gone now with all the looting and all of the excusing of the looting. But I think most can agree that there are improvements that can be made for cops in terms of how they're trained and how they are able to de-escalate situations. If we can get this to push forward some kind of change where they're actually changing the training, they actually have some requirements for jiu-jitsu or other similar stuff, whether it's Krav Maga, but other similar martial arts where there actually is some sparring involved where the cops can kind of get used to dealing with resistant opponents, maybe even require cops to at least do like one martial arts competition before they're officially on the force or before they solidify that requirement. I think that would go a long way in helping curb these situations where cops are overreacting and killing people, where sometimes people are applying race as the reason for it, and sometimes when it's not clear that you can apply race, like the Daniel Schaefer situation, then people are just kind of sweeping it under the rug. But this isn't a problem that can't be solved. It's definitely a problem where you can make things a lot better, and it's unfortunate that it doesn't seem like the focus of a lot of people is in that direction. But hopefully when the dust clears, then that's the direction we can push forward to, and that's something that we can see. I don't know that a ton of police unions are going to be in favor of it, but at this point, you got to give something, and I don't think that's the biggest chip that you can give up. So that covers it for this week. Kind of unfortunate that I had to end on that note, but obviously next week I'll be recapping UFC 250, talking about the June 13 card coming up the week after that, which I believe is headlined by Jessica Ai and Cynthia Calvillo. So hopefully they build out a pretty solid undercard on that I can talk about, because that main event is pretty weak. But with that being said, I'll still talk about that. I'll recap the Who's Number One event from Flow Grappling, and if there's anything else to talk about, I'm sure I'll bring that up as well. So thanks for taking the time to listen to this one. This is a much longer podcast than usual because there was that sort of political aspect that had to come in at the end. But if you stuck through all the way, I definitely appreciate it.